Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Deep Data Dive. We're your co-hosts, Vijay and Laura. And today we actually have a special guest, Jonathan Bechtel, who is a self-taught data scientist. And I was a genius who accidentally butchered his last name when I introduced him. And also I realized I didn't do a very good job introducing the episode. So I'm really sorry. And here's hopefully a better introduction. So for this episode, we wanted to talk about how to get into data science. And that's to touch upon the stories of how each of us, me, Vijay, and Jonathan got into data science, the different ways that you could get into data science via traditional masters, a boot camp, or being self-taught, as well as going into a little bit about the job application process and how, like data science hiring has changed. So, we had a really, really great discussion as a result. This became a really, really long episode, so we're going to break it up into two pieces. So in part one, we're going to talk about how we got into data science and the different ways into data science. And in part two, we'll talk about the job application process, as well as, what's it like applying now versus a couple of years ago. So here you are, and first you'll see part one. Okay.
All right, it's recording.
All right.
It's recording.
Cool. Great. Awesome. Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Deep Data Dive. Today we have a guest. All right. Our guest is Jonathan Bechtel. Would you want to introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit more about you?
Sure. So my name is actually Jonathan Bechtel, not Bechtel, but no worries. My name is Jonathan Bechtel, and so I work as a data scientist here in the greater New York area. I am an instructor for data science for General Assembly, where I teach about twice a week, more or less, on the topics of Python, data science, machine learning, and data visualization, and then also work privately with a collection of about 4 different companies in the New York area, and then also abroad remotely in some other countries, and so not other countries, other cities. And I have been doing this for about 5 years or so. And that's kind of me in a nutshell. And so most of my time is either spent teaching or working at my desk, doing some combination of programmatic data extraction and pipelining in Python, and then building out various types of dashboards and analytical techniques on top of those. And so I think I work probably in a few different industries simultaneously, which I think kind of gives me a nice perspective. And then also have a chance to actually interact with different types of organizations and not just kind of one, which I think also tends to be a bit helpful for my own work experience, because I think it's actually fairly easy to kind of have some experiences on the job or in the industry, whatever, that are very specific, maybe to your boss, your department, your company, things along those lines. Or, if you work in a specific industry, I think things can kind of really be shoehorned around like certain types of practices and ideas and that kind of thing. So I think I kind of have a chance just to kind of sample from different parts of the data science ecosystem. And so, yeah, it's great. And, I like what I do, and I'm happy just to be being this kind of, jack of all trades, data and analytics guy, so love it, really. And I think that's probably the postcard version of me and what I do.
All right. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us and being willing to be a guest on our podcast and our topic.
I'll just say,
today.
Sorry, yeah. I'm cutting you off, but like when I heard about it, I actually knew that I wanted to be on it.
Awesome. No, we're really flattered.
Yeah. There's some kind of voice called within me, and so I just knew I had to be on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm honored. So yeah, basically today's topic, with Jonathan, we'll be discussing how to get into data science. So we'll talk briefly about stories of how each one of us got into data science, maybe some ways of which a person can break into data science. We'll touch briefly on job application process and maybe a few other things to think about if you're interested in getting into data science. Sound good, everybody?
Sounds good.
Sign me up.
All right, cool. So our first topic is talking about how we each got in. So Jonathan, since you're a guest, do you want to tell us how you got into doing data science?
Yeah, sure. So I would say my entry into data science was probably a little more on the unofficial side. So I had been programming for some time before I officially kind of wanted to go into like data science itself, or as a formal profession, things like that. So I am 36 right now. I have been coding in some capacity since I was 25. So you could say I've been doing it for 11 years now. You could also say that I actually didn't start doing it though until after college, really seriously. So depending on how you would interpret that, you could say I'm either very experienced, but also maybe I didn't really like my first formal education. Was not explicitly about writing software, programming, whatever. But by the time I really kind of wanted to go into data science, I already had about 3 or 4 years of Python and JavaScript experience behind me. I wasn't a professional software developer or anything like that, but I was still pretty fluent in things along those lines with the basic ideas and principles. And I had more of a bootstrapped approach. So I basically kind of started acting like a data scientist before I was one. And so I was more of a fake it till you make it kind of guy. And so this included actually holding some of my own workshops around the city before I was affiliated with anyone. I actually had a co-working space, and so I ran a meetup group there about kind of like aspects of programming and data and things along those lines. I was familiar with with pandas and some of this. I didn't actually very know much about something like deep learning or some like the more contemporary techniques, things like that. But I understood like linear regression and then data preparation techniques and things along those lines. And so things like that. And so I had a regular meeting there. And then also I volunteered to work with a few different organizations around the city. And so this is mostly just through people I know. The biggest one was my mom's church had a community organization where they worked with a bunch of people every single week. And so I actually worked with them, actually building up basically a data operating system, you could say, like a reporting system for tracking, measuring, and collecting information, and then reporting what was happening with them, things like that. And so kind of thinking about like different types of metrics and objectives they really cared about and how you kind of like log it, and then thinking through how you'd actually kind of like collect that information and set it up like throughout like the organization for like their different outposts. And in a lot of ways, I think that's actually pretty close to what data science is, in like a lot of context. And so so I kind of gave myself the job of data scientist and kind of found ways to go out and do it, mostly uncompensated for about 6 to 9 months before I began getting approached for paid work. And this is around the same time also I began doing some teaching for General Assembly. And at that point, I was pretty comfortable in front of an audience and things like that and explaining things to people. And so in a lot of ways, I actually think the role I play now is where I actually spend a lot of time explaining things to other people, both like officially as a teacher, but then also unofficially when I work with other companies. A decent part of what I do is actually kind of like explaining to various people how things work and kind of, being more of a, a consultant or an aid to their own understanding and things like that. And so I actually think my slightly informal background and approach in the industry actually ended up helping me quite a bit. Because I did have to self-teach myself quite a few things, and so I think kind of like the process of understanding, actually being able to get something, I'm pretty good at relating that to other people, kind of understanding like where people's points of misunderstanding are. And so it's aided me in kind of like my own communication skills. And so I actually think in a lot of ways, my own progression into data science, I think is actually pretty particular, the kind of the soil that I grew out of, and how I kind of approached it 6 or 7 years ago. Because in a lot of ways, that particular start and those circumstances, I think are still compounding for me.
Oh yeah, that's like a really cool story. It just sounds like basically you were self-taught into data science.
I was pretty self-taught in the data science. Yeah, I think I was for the most part. Yeah. Yeah, I think you could probably say that. I think the most important things, I was probably self-taught. I had a little bit of starter, like again, a little bit of help. I had something of a quantitative background, and actually I've always loved, I was probably into whatever you'd call data science before it was officially called data science, and so I actually have a long record of, like in my personal life, of doing excessive amounts of data tracking and record keeping and things like that, analysis and that kind of stuff. So I actually think my own aptitude for the industry, not that I don't think I'm some sort of like natural savant or things like that, but just in terms of my interests and the way I like to organize and think about stuff, I just think it tends to map pretty well to data science. So it's kind of, I think, a little easier for me than maybe others, just to kind of naturally kind of go into the industry without a formal introduction, because I feel like it selects for a set of skills and interests that I've already had. before it became, kind of a formal occupation. In fact, I think probably the reason why I decided to kind of officially go into data science is, reading the job descriptions and what they do and things like that, it just kind of like stuck out to me. Like that's probably something I'd really like to do. And it seems like I kind of do that anyways, so might as well go ahead and go into it.
Oh, that's really, really cool. Yeah, it just sounds like you landed in something that works really well for you and were able to pick up the skills. Did you major in undergrad in any sort of quantitative discipline? Like, did you learn how to code when you were in college or anything like that?
Yeah. So in university, my background officially is in the biological sciences, and so I was not doing like heavy coding there or things like that. So I definitely was not like computer science or anything like that. But I did work in research labs there, things like that. I actually helped author some papers and things along those lines. And actually worked like with a few other research projects. And so my initial like programming background was doing things actually with a lot of help too. I would say it was not very independent. But things like Stata or WinSteps, and like MATLAB, like kind of like the stuff that typically has like the heavy academic licenses associated with it and that kind of stuff, And so that's pretty far removed from what you do now in a lot of ways. Like I don't actually, if I had to sit down now, like I would not know how to use SAS, or WinSteps or whatever, that kind of thing. But like if you had like a database or a CSV file of your experimental results, things like that, that's what you would use to like, run a regression or like, get like your results from like an ANOVA analysis or things along those lines. And so it was doing that stuff in a fairly supervised way. And again, it kind of gave me a taste of like experimental results and data and things along those lines. And then probably most importantly though, I actually just programming as a general hobby, I began picking up on my own. And so I actually started doing HTML and CSS, because building websites and things like that seemed fun. And that turned into JavaScript and Python and things along those lines. And then, eventually, when I started doing work with some other people, at this point, I was working with pandas, or rather Python, which turned into pandas, things like that. And then, even though I didn't have like a huge background, like I knew about things like ANOVA, linear regression, and some of like the other things, or like t-stats and that kind of stuff, which is actually a pretty decent foundation for going into data science. It's not like the only way or things along those lines, but so I began kind of recreating that stuff, using the Python ecosystem, and then, everything's kind of grown around that.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. That's like kind of really similar to like my story, because that's where I sort of picked up, I guess, some of my foundational like data science knowledge. We'll get to that later. I'm trying to think. But yeah, that's like absolutely a fantastic, really awesome story about getting into data science. Vijay, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you got into data science?
Sure. So I started back in 2015. Back then I was working in the semiconductor space. And from there, I had an interest in making data-driven decisions and actually building the software systems to automate things. And so that's 2015 is like when I officially started into that space. But going to what Jonathan said, I did coding back in high school. I used C++, I made third-person shooter games. I didn't do much in undergrad, and there were a lot of people in bioengineering who were much better than me, including my co-host right now in this podcast.
Dude, I was terrible at programming in undergrad. We'll get to that shortly.
Yeah, but you were better in everything else that was important in the major. But going back to data science, with the master's program, I went to Stevens, and it's actually a coincidence that I'm wearing this shirt right now. It was like unplanned, but in the Stevens master's program, I did it in a year because I was pretty excited to do it. I took classes in machine learning, big data, and AI. So I've used quite a bit of Python, including pandas, what Jonathan mentioned. I used AWS EMR clusters, in particular, using MLLive to do this cool Kaggle competition to predict crime for the San Francisco Bay Area with 15 years worth of data. and I used IBM Watson. And coincidentally, I then worked at IBM using the Watson natural language services. And that was pretty cool because with that, I started to become more of a developer, software engineer, in that I built end-to-end applications throughout from the beginning, from the data ingestion all the way to the model deployment. After IBM, I then worked at Vijay's Wholesale Club, in which I co-owned a few different production recommender systems using more of those AWS EMR clusters that I mentioned that I started out in grad school with. And after Vijay's Wholesale Club, right now I'm doing some, well, I only got a couple different companies, Socioprofit, Big Data Protocol, and setting things up from the ground up. And that's pretty cool. All that's in Python. So that's basically my story. And Laura, you can ask me questions about that or about why I wasn't so cool in undergrad. It's all on the table.
Dude, you were cool enough in undergrad, but maybe it's because we went to a school where we're all just giant nerds. But I guess going back to about your master's program, so you mentioned that all the different things, like what type of classes were you taking when you were in your master's?
So there were like a lot of, so on the stats side, I took multivariate statistics. I then took data mining that led to the machine learning. And then I took a class in big data distributed computing. That's one aspect of it. I also took design of experiments, and I'm thinking about the software side. I took a web mining or a text mining class in Python. I took a few different database classes, learning about the star schema, the snowflake diagrams, like just the theory behind that. Let's see, I also took a class using like graph databases, and then a few different like business analytics classes too, just using some of the advanced features in Excel. And well, just a capstone project, but I'm like cycling through because I took 12 different classes and I'm thinking of each one, but at a high level, that's pretty much it.
Fantastic. No, that definitely sounds like you got like a really good, like sort of broad introduction to a whole bunch of different areas. But this is maybe a semi-related question. What made you leave the semiconductor industry and decide to pursue data science?
Well, data science was this new and emerging phenomenon back in 2015, and I wanted to be part of that ride. And at the same time, I wanted to develop latent skills that I had but never fully mastered, like the programming, and then going back to the math and statistics. Because although I was doing statistical process control and design of experiments in the semiconductor space, I wanted to go a lot further, and the data science space was definitely a way to do that.
Nice. I think if there's anything else. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about any of the places that you worked, or like what you learned getting into data science?
Yeah. Well, I mean, compared to school, in school, it's just using a Jupyter notebook. It's just using a Panda script. It's just looking at data that's already cleaned or something from a Kaggle data set. But in the industry, data is definitely not perfect. And solving a problem, whether or not using machine learning, it's kind of ambiguous because it doesn't always work, and it can be very messy sometimes, especially with tight deadlines. And going back to what I said about the tech stack, it's not just making a simple notebook or just getting data in the CSV files, connecting to different databases, different data sources, maintaining databases, accessing the cloud, that's definitely a big one. And although I did use AWS in school, like there's so much more to keep in mind upon learning in a job and accessing other services like Docker containers. And there's like a whole beast to it, especially both on the business side and on the software development side, the building of something that's going to be used for a long time in production. And so with IBM, I learned like all the ingredients. With Vijay's Wholesale Club, I learned how to create maintainable code in production and have several people approve it. And with the more recent startups that I'm helping, I'm learning what are the main fundamentals that I need to reinforce to set something up and communicate with people like on the CEO level.
Nice. Yeah, it just sounds like, there's just so much to learn. It's not just, being able to, like solve data science or machine learning problems. It's like maintenance of code, being able to work inside an ecosystem of a whole bunch of different things involved in tech stack, as well as a whole bunch of different people who specialize in different parts of the job.
Yeah, I think it, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. As I say, I think a lot of it is actually kind of find like data solutions and then finding like ways to sort of drop them into, like tech stack solutions and like, business problems and things along those lines. And so you typically spend less time than you think just kind of doing like pure data science or modeling and things like that. And then a lot of time trying to grapple with how things are actually supposed to work for the company itself. And so it's usually a separate issue that's pretty idiosyncratic to like a particular organization or industry.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I guess as for my background, so just as a short recap, Vijay and I went to undergrad together and we were in the same major together. But unlike Vijay, I did not learn how to program until I was an undergrad. And it turns out I was really, really horrible at it the first couple of times I did it. So we were learning in MATLAB how to build a few basic programs. I think it was to measure water runoff, like body temperature and a few other things. Anyway, I did horrible in that class. I don't know how I passed, barely understood anything, but that was my first introduction into coding. And then like shortly after undergrad, I decided to go to grad school for public health. And then that's when I was studying like epidemiology and like environmental health. So that's how I got my first intro really into like a lot of like statistics, data science, and machine learning was when I was there. And we learned about, like your like linear logistic regression, your like ANOVA tests, and all those things that you would use in an academic research setting, because that was a thing that was being done a lot where I went to grad school, was conducting a lot of observational cohort studies. And then these are the methods that we learned in order to analyze data from those. And then while I was there, I picked up learning like Stata and R and a little bit of SAS, although I'm still terrible at SAS to this day. We didn't use it that much. That was maybe something that was unique about our school back at the time, was I think most universities were still teaching their public health students in SAS, but we were not. Anyway, so that's one thing that I really liked, was just learning. That's how I learned how to analyze data. That's how I learned how to clean data, how to prepare it to do, like any sort of simple or multi-variable like regression, write up all of your results, make a nice paper and everything. So that's like the one thing that I really, really enjoyed about being in grad school was, like crunching all the data, analyzing all of it, and presenting the findings. And I thought I'd stay in academia. So after I finished and got a PhD, I went and I did a postdoc. But the one thing I realized was that as one moves up the academic career path, one spends less and less time analyzing the data. You spend more time writing grants to apply for funding. Anyway, it turned out I was really, really terrible at that. So that's what made me want to leave academia, because it wasn't something that I really wanted to do just from like a work standpoint, because it meant that I didn't get to do what I liked. Took a short little detour, did a little bit of medical writing, but realized I definitely missed working with data. So after that, I was like, no, yeah, let's go back. Let's consider data science. Like, this is a much better way of utilizing the skills that I had learned in grad school and doing something that I actually like to do and allowing me to have a really good career path outside of academia in it. So applied for Inside Data Science, which is one of those bootcamp programs, which is sadly not around. So I did that program, went through like a very long job search afterward, and then landed my first job. It was at Bridget, which is a financial wellness app. And I was hired as their first data scientist to work on credit risk modeling to determine who Bridget should and shouldn't make an advance out to using machine learning. So I was there for a little bit before landing where I am right now at CVS, where I work on various text messaging programs trying to increase patient adherence. So that's where I am now. And yeah, basically I used to be an academic and now I'm not.
I think a secret benefit of the data science industry, I don't think it gets verbalized very, very well. It has been a great career off-ramp for, I would say, academics who are somewhat confused about their future career path after realizing that getting a professorship is either not going to be feasible or what they thought it was going to be in the first place. I think lots of people who have gone into things like economics, or public health, or psychology and things like that, where like kind of nominally you're meant to study the social sciences or some other field, but along the way you get trained, to work with like data and analyzing experiments and things like that. And so it turns out for a lot of these people, I kind of include myself in this, not nearly as much as you, obviously, because I didn't go as far down the academic route as you did. But it just seems like data science is kind of like the most natural way for people like that to really find themselves a useful occupation.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, Jonathan. I mean, there's a bunch of off ramps for people from academia who decide not to stay. And I guess a lot of people can't stay in academia for a lot of like major structural reasons that we don't have time to address, because that's literally like an entire
it's a different podcast. Yeah.
In and of itself.
I think it's actually a separate podcast series, things like that, like the structural issues with academia. So
yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think, it was a great off ramp. And when I was at Insight, I met people from a bunch of different academic backgrounds, but the one thing we all had in common was we all learned how to work with data and programming in some way, shape, or form. Oh yeah, and now that I think of it, I forgot to mention that I think I didn't learn Python until like 2017, and that's kind of self-taught when I learned it from taking one of those free classes at Code Academy. But the nice thing was, the second time around, learning coding was just a lot easier than it was when I was an undergrad. And then
it's about 10 times easier the second time.
Yeah, I was totally. Yeah. And then, I was kind of semi self-taught pandas by following a bunch of tutorials that I found online, some Udemy courses, stuff like that. So I was semi self-taught for really just the programming part, but I had already had a lot of like academic training for like the data science, machine learning, like the statistical part. And that was the one thing that one of my instructors taught me was, like, don't worry too much about like the language, because that can change, but like the fundamentals of like statistics and like epidemiology are like pretty much always the same. And that's what you always want to make sure that you're solid on. And what, she was right.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, actually.
So yeah, that's basically how I got into data science. So I guess just thinking about sort of our next topic was something that I guess we all briefly touched upon because of our different backgrounds, was the different ways into data science. So, we covered, like, Jonathan, you're self-taught, basically. Vijay, you went and did like a more traditional master's, and I did a boot camp. So I guess just sort of like thinking about all of this, like, what do you think could possibly be like the strengths and weaknesses of, I guess, all the different ways of getting into data science, or at least the ones that we can think of, because I'm pretty sure there are more that we haven't touched upon or are aware of?
So I would say if you go down more of the self-taught path, I would say you're not going to have the fastest way to actually attract someone in an HR department. things like that. The fastest way to do that is to probably just kind of go and get like a master's degree or do something a bit more formal that's more easily recognized. I definitely think that if you do self-taught, it is probably one of the fastest ways to actually gain the requisite knowledge to be functional on the job itself. So I would say it definitely took a while before my professional pedigree kind of like caught up to like my skill sets. But like when it's actually kind of like getting like my hands dirty, just kind of doing like data science and stuff, things like that, even though I didn't actually realize it at the time. And this is when I was at the very beginning of my curve, right? So this kind of like, I wasn't even calling myself a data scientist or things like this, kind of following kind of like a sort of, crude intuition, right? About kind of being the best thing. A lot of the problems I ended up being faced with, actually, I think replicated pretty well to what I'm doing now. So in terms of like maybe seeding yourself with kind of like a deployable skill set, I think the self-taught path works pretty well. Now, of course, again, it would probably be more difficult to actually get hired by certain firms doing what I did and things like that. So I think if you actually wanted to work for a more traditional organization, in some ways it would be more expedient to do, what probably Vijay or other people do, kind of like go into a master's degree and things along those lines. But I do think versing yourself in the actual workflow of like your daily job, things like that, I think self-teaching tends to be probably the fastest way to do that. Even though again, you'll be slow to pick up certain types of pedigree that certain types of roles or hiring managers might find useful.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just like to chime in real quick and say that I think regardless of the path, like with the master's program or the boot camp, you're only taught everything up until that point, until which you graduate. The field is constantly changing and evolving. So at some level, everybody's self-taught. With me, I finished back in 2016. The first stable version of TensorFlow came out in 2017. That's something I had to learn on my own. And with NLP, just like in the last couple of years with BERT and the transformers and the attention mechanism and deep learning, all that stuff just came out of the woodwork, out of nowhere. So I think on some level, we're all self-taught, but perhaps going to what Jonathan said, or maybe this is my opinion, but I think maybe being self-taught at the beginning might be good because it gets people into that habit of being self-taught throughout and afterwards as well.
Yeah, I think it's always a good habit to have some degree of being able to self-teach yourself as a data scientist, because everything's always changing. Like maybe like at my old job, I think I had to learn how to use like Google Cloud Platform, and here we're on like Microsoft with Azure. Like a lot of other companies use AWS. So you always have to be able to be self-taught, because you have to learn a new thing when you either change jobs or when a new thing comes out. And Vijay, I know you went to like a traditional master's program. I think you mentioned that your program was one of the first masters of data science that was available.
That's right. I think, I'm trying to think, it started a couple of years before I started. So I think back in the 2013, 2014 year. And then I know Insight, as you mentioned, that started back in 2012.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I know there are definitely like a lot more like master's programs now. So there's more formal education going into being a data scientist. Whereas I guess when we were trying to enter, there was maybe a lot less. And it just sounds like, Vijay, at least from my perspective of what I'm getting from what you learned, it seems like you had like a really good, like well-rounded sort of like foundational background in a bunch of different topics from being in your master's program.
Yeah, I think so. And I agree.
Yeah, Vijay, your class mix actually sounds like a pretty good one between like larger, like big data skills, and kind of the more traditional stat stuff, like design of experiments, things like that, which I actually think is a little underrated, because kind of being able to like, measure like treatment effects and things like that is pretty important. I would be curious, what do you two things? What were your most interesting classes that you took? And then also, which one has been most professionally useful for you? Because I kind of heard you talk about like the curriculum that you took. It's actually a question popped into my head.
All right. Well, the second question is easy to answer, and I'll start to do it, but then bleed into the first as I still answer the second question. But in terms of what's useful professionally, different things have come up with different times. And an example with that, with one of the interesting classes with using Watson. So when I first tried to use the APIs back in school, I actually struggled with it. And then when I was at IBM and when I had to use other APIs, actually the technology changed in Bluemix, because back in school, it can only support Java. And I did learn Java in the middle, but by the time I used it at IBM, it was built to handle Python. So, but that was good. But I learned to, I had another attempt at learning the APIs at Watson, and I cleared that hurdle, and that was pretty cool. That's one example. Another example is with the big data distributed class, distributed computing class. I mean, I did basic, I did a basic a job with the Kaggle composition that I mentioned. And then after IBM at Vijay's, I got to revisit using those EMR clusters. And I mean, it changes so much over the years, but I was able to do more with it than I did in school. So the short answer is it introduces one to a lot of different areas. So throughout the career, one can revisit those different areas that one learned in school. And I'm pretty sure that as I progress, I'll touch upon different things that I haven't seen in a long time, but revisit it from what I've learned in school.
Nice. So I guess a lot of your classmates now, are they also, they're still in data science?
I would say so, yes.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, you know, I'm the person here who did the bootcamp. So I did Insight Data Science back in 2019. And so I guess the difference here being that the bootcamp does take a shorter period of time, since our bootcamp session itself was really only like 7 or 8 weeks. And the first 3 to 4 weeks, you spend that making kind of like doing your own like data science project. And then the next couple of weeks, you spend that sort of like demoing it at different companies that Insight contracts with to hire, and then also prepping for data science interviews. So the bright side is that the program is like really, really fast in terms of time. So it's a shorter time commitment if you're thinking about really just the program itself being 7 weeks, and then maybe several weeks afterward for job searching and for, you know, demoing your project at different companies. The one downside is that unlike you, Vijay, I didn't really get sort of like the well-rounded sort of introduction to all of the different topics, since when you're in the bootcamp, especially at Insight, since it was very much project focused, everybody learned like, you know, like different things that they needed to do for their project. So if somebody was working on an NLP project, they would learn a lot more about NLP. But if you weren't, you maybe learned very little about NLP. So that's like where it was like very different, was what everybody learned was very specific to what their projects were about. And then I guess the other part of Insight was learning about data science interviewing and cramming for that. So we spent a lot of time maybe just like learning some like foundational things about either like how to use SQL, like maybe how to code gradient descent. I should have done that, but I didn't. Sorry.
Okay. We won't tell anyone.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's like where it was like really different, was in like how and like what we learned. But I guess on the bright side, it did allow me to transition very quickly. But also the one thing that is very unique about Insight is that it does require one to have a PhD, either you either had to have had one, like graduated, or be close to graduating if you're a current PhD student. So what they're really looking for is people who already have a lot of the quantitative skills from like a coding, data science, and machine learning standpoint in a quantitative discipline. So a lot of the fellows I was with already had either like PhDs or were getting PhDs in like physics or math, epidemiology, and so on. So I guess it was like a very specific pool of people. And that was primarily what Insight was designed to do, was transition people from academic background into data science. So that's what was something that it did do very well.
So Laura, can I just ask you a question? Something I'm kind of curious about is, so for your boot camp that you took, it seemed like it worked out well for you, right? Like you're working as a data scientist now, things like that. So you got your desired outcome out of it.
Yeah.
In terms of its benefits, how much of it was just due to the fact that it just kind of like forced you to work extremely hard, you know, for 2 or 3 months, like just kind of like put yourself at it, and how much was really due to the specific material that they taught you?
I think it was really, most of it was that they forced you to work really, really hard. But I think the other bit that was mentioned, I think by my program director, was that, you know, this was basically kind of having like a stamp of approval saying that this person knows how to do the job of being a data scientist, because that's one of the hardest things coming out of academia, is being able to communicate what you can do and what abilities you have to a non-academic audience, because everything has, you know, like a different terminology. And like when you are in academia, you know, like you have work that has like a very specific focus that sometimes is not what a person in industry would be interested in, even though the skills that you have would be applicable to them. So Insight was sort of a showcase of, this is what this person can do with their skills in like an industry like facing manner.
Yeah. One thing I've definitely noticed, you know, I actually am comfortable in an academic setting. So I think in like some ulterior, like, you know, different universe, we're like, there are actually just more like academic jobs that are out there and things like that. Like it was a more viable career. I could actually see myself going down there and sticking with it for a long time. And then one thing that kind of strikes me about people who, like, if I'm working for, you know, someone inside of an org who's maybe not explicitly technically trained, things like that, like the range that you have to maybe talk about, you know, conceptual topics just for their own sake is considerably smaller than in academia, you know. And so when I talk with people who are maybe interested in, like, you know, studying ideas for their own sake, the ability to kind of like talk about things in an abstract way is very, very large. But if you're dealing with stakeholders, being able to communicate things in a very, very particular way has a lot of importance. And I think for me, it's actually been a big transition, kind of going from one mindset to the other. So I feel like that's maybe something that you could probably would be helped out, you know, doing something like Insight.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing to touch upon is that when you're in academia, you kind of get to work on whatever interests you to some extent, but also that in industry, you do not get to do that. Usually the priority is going to be whatever is profitable for the company.
Yeah,
So you might be
whatever
really
kind of metric they care about. Right.
time for that, because, you know, the main purpose of the company is to be profitable. And
I mean, sometimes there's both, but it depends. Sorry to cut you off.
wait, what were you saying again?
Oh, I said sometimes there could be a pretty big overlap. So it's hard to say that it's mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and I think like how much autonomy you have to determine what you want to do as a data scientist will differ in between like each company, because like some companies, like the senior leadership will determine what the data scientists will do. I think in other companies, the data scientists have more independence to figure out what they think might work for the company.
Yeah, I think it's probably generally true that the more heavily embedded in like some kind of like core tech a company is, the more likely it is you might have a little more autonomy over what you choose. You know, so like if you actually work at like a company whose primary like bread and butter is maybe like building analytical software, you know, your work is going to overlap with things that are conceptually interesting much more. You know, and you can kind of like double dip between like academic research and settings and things like that and what you do at work, because there's more of a clean interface. But, you know, if you work for a drugstore, you know, or a nursing home center or things like that, and you're part of their data science department, I think probably what they're going to ask for is going to be much more narrow. and it has to get really closely hemmed in to whatever they're looking for. And it's not really going to have much to do with kind of the cutting edge of the industry or, new advances in algorithms or things like that. At least that's been my case, So whenever I've worked with an org that's just not like data science itself as a field of study is kind of peripheral to like what they actually do to make money. Usually the data science work is pretty much subservient to whatever kind of type of reporting framework that they have, or like your profit-making framework that they have, and things like that. And like your room to kind of like just kind of explore like the space of ideas tends to get heavily reduced.
Yeah. But I guess, like each company does their own like different things. So that was maybe like one other advantage of being at Insight, was going on the different sort of like company visits to demo and to have like the companies come in and talk about what they do. So you can see like all the different applications that they're using data science for. So like, one company is using it to figure out, where's like, who's the best person to sell this like online ad to, like how do we boost like ad sales or like subscriptions. And another one's using it to be like, here's like the best way to like stock our warehouses if we want to offer like free 2-day shipping to everybody in the continental United States. I think, so the topics were like really, really varied. Others were, I guess, in the health focused ones, we're trying to figure out sort of like what's like the life cycle of like treatment for like oncology drugs. And different topics like that. So that was something that was really nice about Insight, coming from the academic background, is being able to see how data science is applied in like various industry settings.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I know, Jonathan, you teach at General Assembly, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So is their program sort of boot camp like?
General Assembly, I actually think, has one of the more varied product offerings, for tech education. So they have classes and workshops, which I teach. It's kind of like something for 3 hours or 6 hours or 1 or 2 days, things along those lines. In fact, I think I had you as a student one of those once, Laura, if I'm not mistaken. Okay.
And that's how we met.
Yeah, that's how we met. They teach part-time classes, which meet twice a week for about 10 weeks. Those aren't really done with the stated intention of allowing you to completely switch careers or things like that. It's more about people who are just looking to upskill, or help get a promotion, or just maybe if you work as an analyst already and you want to be a little more data science centric in your own work, but don't really want to leave like your day job, you do those things. And then they also have the full stack program, which is kind of what you did at Insight. And that's basically you take off for 3 months, and then full time, you do it full tilt. And then they have, career counselors, and they help you out with your resume and things along those lines. And so that replicates pretty well to what you were just talking about. And so I actually deal with bootcamp students going into it and coming out of it, like in terms of the full-time one. I've never actually taught one myself. And so, but I do stuff in the evenings for part-time classes and workshops. So
nice.
Yeah. And so
it's kind of okay, you can go first and I'll just bring
I was gonna say, since we're talking about like boot camps and things like that, like it's kind of noticed, one thing I've noticed is that typically I've actually noticed like a number of students going into boot camps, things like that, because they've taken workshops with me and stuff like that. And then quite a few times I actually see them as they progress, because I interact with them like in sort of indirectly. Or afterwards, I kind of see how like they handle themselves and that kind of thing. And so I talk with them about like their job prospects and that kind of stuff. And so it does seem to me like the kind of like the ideal bootcamp student, in terms of like whoever like gets like the most value out of like the program and that kind of stuff, is usually someone who on their own doesn't quite have the pedigree or the skill set to really kind of get themselves into a job yet. They just kind of understand the field reasonably well, but they couldn't reason very carefully about lots of like different like topics in the field. But their basic coding backgrounds and kind of knows for like the main concepts tends to be pretty good, and things along those lines. And so those people typically do a fairly good job of like going through the paces and then coming out, having some good projects by their side and getting like an entry-level job, somewhere as like an entry-level data scientist or an analyst. And so my feeling is that like if you're kind of in like that like bucket of like person, student or whatever, the boot camp actually seems to work out pretty well for you. And it's actually probably better than the alternative because it's faster, than going to graduate school, and it's more targeted, and like the opportunity cost of your time, once you factor that in, it's the best set. But I think sometimes for people who are honestly just maybe need a bit more seasoning or don't quite pick up the material as quickly, the slower burn tends to be more helpful for them in the long run. Because I've actually seen a few students go into boot camps who had the best of intentions and sometimes work really hard, but their baseline level of just kind of like data instincts and programming knowledge wasn't really high enough for them to really get the most that they could out of like the program. And when they came out, their level of retention wasn't quite high enough, to really kind of make themselves as competitive as they wanted to. So I think since we're talking about it, things like that, and kind of like, getting into data science, I just kind of noticed myself like, you're probably like the spitting image of someone who's well suited to like take advantage of a boot camp, because you already have like a PhD and like, public health. And so your quantitative background is really solid. So it's kind of like a way just to kind of like make sure you knew kind of like the last like 5 to 10%. But more generally, that type of person tends to do best, I think, with the bootcamp medium.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something that I think was addressed at Insight, I think during one of our like introductory sessions, as we're saying, like as an Insight fellow, you probably already know like 95% of what you need to know to be a data scientist. We're just here to sort of add that last 5%. And I guess now that gets us into like the next topic, which is, I guess, try like just touching really briefly on the job application process, because I realized that applying for jobs in data science. So this was a really, really, really cool discussion that we had with Jonathan, and it turned out to be really long. So we're going to end part 1 here. And then we're going to talk about job applications and the past versus the future in part 2. So thank you very much for joining us for part 1, and we'll see you in part 2.